Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke, right? So the problems are, let's say, the tragedy of the world, the malevolence of the human heart, and the tyranny of the state. And like, those are, if you don't understand that you would run from those problems when you really looked at them, then you haven't considered the problems. And they exist at all levels, right? It's not just the social and the political or the economic, it's also the psychological. It's like, well, human malevolence. There's an abyss. That's a hellish abyss. And it plays itself out in the political world, but it plays itself out in your own world too, in your psychological world. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you like you're a prey animal and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it.
Yeah.
And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Think, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. So, yeah, there's lots of reasons to, because I've thought for a long time, imagine you have a choice in front of you, because you do. So here's the choice. Your life is either meaningful or meaningless. Okay, so let's go through the meaningless part first. Because you think, well, of course I don't want it to be meaningless. It's like, yeah, just hold on a second. Nothing you do matters. And so impulsive pleasure is the order of the day. No responsibility. You can do whatever you want. It's like Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, right? Or it's like Neverland in Peter Pan. You're still a kid. You can play all the time.
Yeah.
Impulsive pleasure and no responsibility. That's the reward for meaninglessness. Okay. Think, well, there's something to be said about that.
And powerlessness to a certain degree. Yeah.
Well, but then the other side is, okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters, right? You make a mistake, hurts you, hurts your family, hurts the world in a deeper way than you think. And you have to be awake to that. And then you have to take it on yourself. It's one thing I understood probably over the last 5 years. I was trying to understand this idea. There's an idea that Christ is the person who takes on the sins of the world onto himself. I thought, what does that mean? Because there's a redemptive idea there, right? So the idea is the Redeemer, the person who redeems everyone is the person who takes the sins of the world onto himself. What does it mean?
Radical
it means it's your fault, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything, the whole bit.
And I think people get tripped up also because at the moment where you admit to yourself that you have the potential to change something, you have to admit to yourself that you've always had the potential to change something. So you have to go back in this recapitulation of everything that you've done and actually confront what you haven't done and all the people you've hurt and all the things, the ways that you've hurt yourself, all the ways that you could have done better. And if that judge is too strong and too harsh and wants to punish you too severely, you say, no, judge, I had no power. Yeah. I'm going to stay here in hell in powerlessness with everybody else because of the oppressive forces that are out there. I don't take any responsibility. But that fucking courage of going, hey, I am responsible for myself and I can make a difference. And I've fucked up in the past and I will fuck up again, but I'm going to own this. That is the true hero's choice.
Yeah, well, it's also the fact that you're fallible is no excuse for not taking responsibility.
Right.
When Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which, is one of the things that brought the terrible Soviet Empire to a standstill, that book. He did that. He said he went over his whole life with a fine-tooth comb, every single thing. When he was in prison, he realized that he had done many things that put him in prison. So he was in two kinds of prisons. He was in the prison the Soviet state produced, And then he was in the prison that the Soviet state produced, that he participated in producing, that then imprisoned him, both at the same time. And so when he figured that out, he thought, okay, well, what did I do in my life to increase the probability that I would end up where I ended up? And so he said he went over his life with a fine-tooth comb. And his question was, is there something I can do now to atone for what I failed to do in the past? And I mean, that was a serious question. He wasn't playing a game. That's why he, could memorize a 1,500-page book, essentially. I mean, it was no game. And the consequences of that were literally world-changing. So that's an interesting thing. Well, so let's say you go over your past with a fine-tooth comb and you decide you're going to take responsibility for everything that you did that was wrong and everything that you failed to do that you could have done that was right. It's like, does that change the world? It's like, depends on how thoroughly you do it. You might say it changes the world like nothing else possibly can. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's actually right.
Yeah.
And that's also a frightening thought, because it means that things would be way better than they are if you weren't so damn useless.
Man, it's cool to go back and to hear those words from Jordan Peterson again, because I remember leaving that podcast and thinking, wow, that was one of the best podcasts I've ever recorded. And still, I don't ever recall leaving a podcast and really feeling that from one of my own podcasts. Maybe some of the Rogan podcasts that I did back in the day, I would have that feeling, because he's just such a incredible thinker and philosopher about different ideas. And in this clip right here, he starts talking about some really interesting ideas of how terrifying it is to look at the problems of the world and realize, like, as without, so within, if we reverse that Hermes Trismegistus quote, as within, so without. So these problems that we see on the outside played out in mass are actually problems that we can find within ourselves. So that idea of malevolence that we can see played out in the political landscape or see played out in certain other areas, if we look deep enough inside ourselves in our own shadow, we're going to find the same thing. As a human being, we're open to all human being experiences, and all of these things that we see externally, we can also find them internally. And that's where it can be so frightening that we're turned to stone when we see it, like the Medusa or like the basilisk. And I think that's a great metaphor. And I love how he talks about all of these stories as things that point to true stories, because that moment where you see something terrifying and you're petrified, well, that happens all the time. And then the natural protectors that come online, to use an analogy from what's called the internal family systems, where we all put forward protectors. Well, the protector that protects us from the scary thing is to avoid and to avert ourselves from that, or to distract ourselves from that. So intoxication or distraction, perpetual action, acting as distraction, ways that we can avoid the terror of what we might find in our own shadows. But what he's ultimately saying is, when we do that, when we have the courage to do that, that may change the world more than anything else can, right? So the most important thing that we can do is to actually have the courage to look at all of those things, all the dark corners, all the murky parts of ourself and the murky parts of the world, and really go over that, like ruthlessly and relentlessly. And I think the key and the point that I was making is that to do that, you have to have the courage to face that. You have to forgive yourself, because you're going to find, if you actually go unbiased without any protectors on board and look at your life, you're going to see a lot of times where you've been selfish. And I certainly have, and I still see those things that I was blind to. I'll be going deep into meditation and I'll look back on my relationship, my past relationship, and I'll look back at something and I'll have to pop out of that meditation and send a text or give someone a call and be like, whoa, hey, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't even realize what I was doing at the time, but now I do. And now I see what effect that had, and I'm sorry. And, hopefully that person forgives me, but most importantly, I have to forgive myself. But the only way to do that is to weed the garden of all of this guilt and shame and recognize that we're all doing the best we can. That's the only thing that we're capable of doing, is doing the best we can. But that forgiveness is necessary for us to actually look in the shadows, because we're looking in the shadows of ourselves, and we're going to have to come face to face with the fact that we are not perfect. and we will never be perfect, and we're constantly going to be making mistakes. And so forgiveness is the prerequisite for the courage to do that. And I think that's the most important thing that you can take from this. So look back at your life, relax. You're going to find stuff. It's cool. Look at your life currently. Look at your psyche currently. Relax. You're going to find stuff. You're going to find greed. You're going to find anger. You're going to find a lot of things. Forgive yourself for that. That's the human experience. But if you're able to look at it unflinchingly, then you can start to change it. You can start to journal about it. You can start to track its source. You can start to apply forgiveness or self-love or any one of these practices. And that, as Jordan Peterson said, might change the world like nothing else can. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe. Also, share with any friend that you think might benefit from it. And lastly, go to aubreymarcus.com, sign up for my newsletter diary, and you won't miss a thing.